The morning of March 3, 1944, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler lifted his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 off the runway at Achmer Airfield, 30 miles southwest of Osnabrück, expecting another routine interception mission. The 8th Air Force was coming again, heavy bombers droning toward targets in central Germany, and Stigler's Jagdgeschwader 3 was scrambling to meet them. Standard procedure by this point in the war climb to altitude hit the bomber formations hard and fast before their fighter escorts' fuel forced them to turn back, then land, rearm, and do it all over again. The Americans had been bombing Germany for over a year, and while the raids were growing larger and more frequent, the tactical pattern remained predictable. The escort fighters, mostly P-47s and P-38s, would shepherd the bombers to the German border, maybe 50 or 70 miles inside. Then their fuel gauges would dictate retreat. That invisible boundary, somewhere over the Rhine or just beyond, marked where German pilots could operate with relative impunity. Beyond that line, they could attack bomber formations without worrying about thunderbolts diving out of the sun or lightnings scissoring in from the flanks. Stigler had flown over 200 combat missions. He knew the rhythms of aerial warfare over the Reich as intimately as a man knows his own heartbeat. The Americans attacked in daylight because they believed in precision bombing, convinced their Norden bomb sites and tight formations could destroy specific industrial targets without the carpet bombing approach the British used at night. The strategy was sound in theory, but brutally expensive in practice. Without fighter protection deep into Germany, American bombers died in catastrophic numbers. The Luftwaffe had been bleeding them systematically throughout 1943, and while German losses were mounting too, the mathematics still favoured the defence. Bombers were big, slow, and vulnerable. Even with their defensive armament, 10 or more 50-caliber machine guns per B-17, they couldn't manoeuvre like fighters, couldn't dive away, couldn't outrun their attackers. A determined assault by experienced German pilots would shred a bomber formation, sending aircraft spinning down in flames, trailing smoke and debris across 30,000 feet of sky. At 26,000 feet that morning, Stigler throttled back slightly and scanned the horizon. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine in his 109 was running smoothly, the supercharger whining as it forced air into the cylinders at altitude where the thin atmosphere would otherwise starve the engine of oxygen. His wingman, a newer pilot named Werner, held position off his right wing, maintaining formation discipline. They were part of a Staffel, a squadron of 12 aircraft, climbing in loose pairs toward the bomber stream. Radio chatter was minimal, professional. Controllers on the ground were tracking the American formation by radar, calling out altitude, heading, and estimated numbers. 600 bombers, maybe more, with what sounded like 300 fighters escorting them. Big raid, but not unprecedented. Stigler had seen worse. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Stigler couldn't know, what none of the German pilots climbing into the cold morning air that day could know, was that everything had just changed. The invisible boundary that protected them deep inside Germany, the fuel limitation that forced American escorts to turn back, the safe zone where bomber interceptions could proceed without interference, all of it was about to vanish. Because far below, tucked among the bomber formations and mixed into the escort groups, were aircraft that looked superficially similar to the P-47s and P-38s the Luftwaffe had been fighting for months. But these were different. These were North American P-51 Mustangs, and they carried enough fuel to chase German fighters all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe intelligence community had known about the Mustang for months. Reports from Western Front units described it as a capable aircraft, fast and maneuverable, used primarily for low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack missions. The British Royal Air Force had been flying Mustangs since 1942, mostly in the tactical support role, where the aircraft's excellent visibility and stable handling characteristics made it effective for strafing and photo reconnaissance. But the early Mustangs had a critical limitation. Their Allison V1710 engines, the same power plants used in P-38s and P-40s, performed poorly at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, they lost power dramatically, making them unsuitable for bomber escort duty, where combat routinely occurred at 25,000 feet or higher. American aviation strategists understood the problem. They needed a fighter that could escort bombers deep into Europe, match German interceptors in performance at altitude, and still have enough fuel to fight and return home. The P-47 partially solved this with its excellent high-altitude performance, but its massive size and fuel consumption limited its range to around 450 miles from base. That got bombers to the German border but left them unprotected for the final legs of missions to Berlin, Leipzig, or the synthetic oil refineries scattered across central Germany. The P-38 had better range, roughly 575 miles, but it was expensive to build, mechanically complex, and suffered from high-altitude engine problems that made it less than ideal for European operations. The solution came from an unlikely combination of British desperation and American engineering pragmatism. In 1942, the British suggested mating the Mustang's excellent airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire so formidable. The Merlin had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power output at high altitude, exactly what the Mustang needed. Packard Motor Company in the United States was already producing licensed copies of the Merlin for British aircraft, so the manufacturing infrastructure existed. North American aviation engineers took the proposal and ran with it, redesigning the Mustang's cooling system, adjusting the airframe to accommodate the new engine, and creating what would become the P-51B model. The transformation was dramatic, with the Packard Merlin V1659 engine producing 1,380 horsepower and a sophisticated two-stage supercharger system. The new Mustang could maintain full power at 30,000 feet. It was faster than the Bf-109G at altitude, could outturn it in most flight regimes, and had acceleration that German pilots would find almost unbelievable. But the Mustang's real revolutionary feature wasn't performance, it was range. The P-51B carried 184 gallons of internal fuel, plus two external drop tanks holding either 75 or 108 gallons each. Total fuel capacity with drop tanks reached 400 gallons, giving the aircraft a combat radius of roughly 650 miles. With careful fuel management and the addition of larger 110-gallon drop tanks developed in early 1944, that radius extended past 850 miles. To put that in perspective, the distance from England to Berlin was approximately 600 miles. The P-51 could escort bombers all the way to the German capital, engage in combat for 30 minutes or more, and still have enough fuel to return to England. No American fighter had ever approached that capability. More importantly, the Germans didn't know it existed. Luftwaffe intelligence in early 1944 was increasingly fragmented and overwhelmed. Operational units filed combat reports describing various Allied aircraft types, but the sheer volume of information and the chaos of a multi-front war made systematic analysis nearly impossible. Reports mentioning Mustangs typically described them as reconnaissance aircraft or tactical fighters operating at low altitude in support of ground forces. There was no indication, no warning, no intelligence assessment suggesting that a new variant with strategic range was about to enter service over Germany. The first P-51Bs arrived in England with the 3-154th Fighter Group in November 1943. Initial missions were cautious, testing the aircraft's capabilities and working out operational procedures. By December, more groups were converting to Mustangs, and by early March 1944, several full groups were operational. But operational tempo and weather conditions meant that German pilots hadn't yet encountered them in significant numbers over Germany's interior. The Mustang groups were flying escort missions, but the Luftwaffe's attention was focused on the bombers themselves and the familiar P-47s they'd been fighting for months. Franz Stigler and his staffel were approaching the bomber formation from the south, climbing through 28,000 feet, when he spotted them. B-17s, flying in tight combat boxes, their contrails stretching across the sky like white chalk lines on a blue slate. Standard formation, maybe 60 aircraft in this particular group, with more formations visible further north. The German fighters would hit them from multiple angles simultaneously, trying to disrupt the defensive coordination and create opportunities for individual attacks. Several bombers would go down, German fighters would be damaged or destroyed in return, and, eventually, the American escorts would intervene, forcing the German pilots to break off or engage in dogfights that burned precious fuel. Then everyone would go home. The pattern had repeated hundreds of times. Stigler armed his weapon systems. The Bf-109 G6 carried one 20mm MG 151 cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm MG 131 machine guns mounted above the engine. Some variants carried additional 20mm cannons in underwing pods, but those added weight and drag that hurt maneuverability. Stigler preferred the standard armament, sufficient firepower to damage bombers without compromising the aircraft's ability to dogfight with enemy fighters. His ammunition counters showed full loads, roughly 200 rounds for the cannon and 600 rounds total for the machine guns, enough for several attack runs if he fired in disciplined bursts. The Staffel leader called out attack positions over the radio, vectoring pairs of fighters toward specific sections of the bomber formation. Stigler and Werner would approach from high and slightly to the port side, diving through the formation in a slashing attack meant to cause maximum disruption. They'd pull up and around for a second pass if conditions allowed, but more likely they'd have to disengage and reposition as the escorts reacted. Stigler pushed the stick forward, beginning his dive, airspeed building rapidly. The B-17s grew larger in his windscreen, their olive-drab paint and white stars clearly visible now. He could see the gun turrets traversing, tracking his approach. The Americans had excellent defensive tactics, overlapping fields of fire that created a lethal zone around each bomber. The trick was to come in fast, fire from outside the truly effective range of their 50 caliber machine guns, and break away before sustaining too much damage. At 800 meters, Stigler opened fire. The 20mm cannon bucked, sending high-explosive shells arcing toward the lead B-17. He saw strikes on the bomber's wing, pieces of aluminum skin tearing away, but the aircraft held formation. The American formations were designed to maintain integrity even when individual aircraft were damaged. Bombers would stay in formation as long as they were physically capable, drawing strength from the overlapping defensive fire of their neighbors. Stigler held his dive for another 2 seconds, firing again, then rolled hard left and pulled up, breaking away from the formation as tracer fire from multiple bombers converged on the space he'd just vacated. Werner followed, and both fighters climbed back to altitude, assessing results. The B-17 Stigler had hit was trailing smoke from an engine, but it was still flying, still in formation. Maybe they'd get lucky and it would fall behind, become vulnerable. But more likely the bomber would make it home, another testament to American engineering's emphasis on survivability. Stigler was preparing for another attack run when something caught his attention. Movement off to his right, higher than he expected, closing fast. His first thought was P-47s, but these aircraft looked different. Slimmer, more graceful lines, and they were coming in from an angle that suggested they'd been flying with the bombers for some time rather than just arriving from a forward patrol area. That was odd. Most escort fighters operated in front of and above the bomber formations, positioned to intercept German fighters before they reached attack positions. These fighters were integrated into the formation itself, almost like they'd been flying alongside the bombers for the entire mission. One of the aircraft rolled and dove towards Stigler's position, and he got his first clear look at it. Single-engine, inline engine configuration like a 109, but the fuselage was different. The canopy was distinctive, a bubble shape that offered exceptional visibility. The wings were laminar flow design, smooth and thin, optimized for high-speed flight. And underneath, he could see the belly radiator scoop that characterized liquid-cooled American engines. This was something new, something he hadn't encountered before. Stigler broke hard right, calling a warning to Werner over the radio. The American fighter followed, and Stigler immediately realized this aircraft could match or exceed his 109's turn rate. That was concerning. P-47s were fast in straight lines and excellent in dives, but relatively poor turners. Stigler could usually evade them by entering a tight turning fight, where the 109's superior roll rate and lower wing loading gave him advantage. This aircraft, whatever it was, turned like a British Spitfire. Tight, controlled, maintaining energy through the turn. Stigler rolled inverted and pulled, executing a split-S maneuver that should have given him separation. But when he leveled out 5,000 feet lower, the American fighter was right there, 400 meters behind and closing. The American pilot knew what he was doing. Stigler advanced his throttle to emergency power, the DB605 engine screaming as boost pressure climbed beyond normal limits. The 109 accelerated, and Stigler began a series of random jinking maneuvers, never holding one direction long enough for the American to establish a good firing solution. Tracers flashed past his canopy, brilliant streaks of light that missed by meters. The American was firing 50 caliber machine guns, 6 or 8 of them judging by the volume of fire. Stigler had seen enough combat to recognize skilled gunnery when he saw it, and this pilot was good, leading the target properly and firing in disciplined bursts rather than holding the trigger down. Stigler chopped throttle and deployed combat flaps, hoping to force an overshoot. The sudden deceleration worked. The American fighter flashed past, close enough that Stigler could see the pilot's head turning, looking for him. Stigler rolled and pulled hard, trying to reverse the situation and get on the American's tail, but the enemy fighter simply pulled up into a near-vertical climb, bleeding speed rapidly but gaining altitude. Stigler tried to follow, but his 109 didn't have the power. He climbed to about 4,000 feet before his airspeed dropped dangerously low, and he had to push the nose down to avoid stalling. When he looked up, the American fighter was above him again, repositioning for another attack. This wasn't how fights with P-47s went. Thunderbolts would make 1 or 2 passes and then either achieve a kill or break off to avoid getting bogged down in a turning fight. This pilot wasn't breaking off. He was staying engaged, using vertical maneuvers and energy management like a Luftwaffe instructor teaching advanced tactics. Stigler dove for the deck, pushing his throttle forward again, hoping to use the 109's excellent dive performance to open distance. His airspeed indicator climbed past 600 kilometers per hour, approaching the aircraft's structural limits. The American followed, matching his dive, and Stigler realized with uncomfortable clarity that this aircraft was faster than his 109 in level flight and at least equal in the dive. At 2,000 meters altitude, Stigler pulled out of the dive and headed east toward Acme airfield. His fuel gauge was showing less than half tanks, and he'd expended most of his ammunition in the bomber attack. This engagement was going nowhere productive. Time to disengage, return to base, and report on this new aircraft type. The American fighter followed for another 30 kilometers, then abruptly broke off and turned back west. Stigler maintained his eastward heading, eyes constantly checking his 6 o'clock, but the American didn't return. When Stigler finally landed at Acme 20 minutes later, his hands were shaking, slightly, adrenaline wearing off, and leaving him with the unsettling realization that he'd just encountered something fundamentally different from anything he'd fought before. The debriefing that afternoon was tense. Multiple pilots reported engagements with the new American fighter type. Descriptions were consistent inline-engine single-seat fighter with exceptional performance at altitude, excellent maneuverability, and aggressive tactics. Several pilots noted that the American fighters had appeared far deeper into Germany than escorts normally operated, suggesting significantly extended range. One pilot claimed he'd been engaged near Magdeburg, over 225 kilometers from the Dutch border. That shouldn't have been possible. No American fighter had that kind of range. The intelligence officer taking notes looked increasingly troubled. If these reports were accurate, and multiple experienced pilots were providing similar accounts, then something significant had changed in the strategic situation over Germany. Luftwaffe operational planning had been built on the assumption that deep into Germany, bomber formations would be vulnerable. That assumption was now in serious question. The intelligence officer promised to forward the reports up the chain of command and requested that pilots try to obtain clearer identification of the aircraft type during future engagements. Gun camera footage would be invaluable if anyone had managed to get good film. Several pilots had fired at the mystery fighters, but combat was chaotic, and it was unclear whether any decisive footage existed. Franz Stigler walked back to his quarters, mind replaying the engagement. The American pilot had been skilled, no question, but the aircraft itself was what bothered him. Its performance envelope overlapped with the 109's almost completely. There were no obvious weaknesses to exploit, no tactical gaps where German pilots could gain advantage. If the Americans were deploying these aircraft in large numbers as escorts, the entire dynamic of the air war over Germany would shift. No longer could Luftwaffe fighters attack bomber formations with impunity in the interior of the Reich. Every mission would now involve fighting through screens of enemy fighters that could pursue German aircraft all the way back to their bases if they chose to. The mathematics of attrition, already unfavorable, were about to become catastrophic. Across Germany that day, similar reports filtered into Luftwaffe operational headquarters. By evening, intelligence analysts were compiling a composite picture from dozens of pilot debriefings. The new American fighter, whatever its designation, had appeared in squadron strength over multiple targets. It had engaged German interceptors far deeper into Germany than previous escort fighters, and its performance characteristics suggested it was equal or superior to both the Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190 in most regimes. This wasn't a minor tactical development. This was a strategic game-changer. Within 48 hours, high-level Luftwaffe commanders were demanding answers. What was this aircraft? How many were operational? What was its combat radius? And most critically, what could be done to counter it? The answers, when they finally came, were not encouraging. Intelligence identified the aircraft as the North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with a British Merlin engine that gave it excellent high-altitude performance. Manufacturing numbers suggested the Americans were producing them in substantial quantities, and more fighter groups were converting to the type. The combat radius appeared to be somewhere between 800 and 1,000 kilometers, effectively covering all of Germany and parts of Poland and Czechoslovakia. As for counters, the only realistic option was to destroy them in combat, and early engagement reports suggested that was going to be difficult. The Mustang's performance was competitive with Germany's best fighters, and American pilot training was improving as experienced veterans rotated home to train new pilots. German pilot quality, conversely, was declining as the Luftwaffe's training programs shortened to rush replacements to operational units. Experienced aces like Stigler could hold their own against Mustang pilots, but the average German pilot in early 1944 had perhaps 160 hours of total flight time before entering combat. American pilots were arriving at units with 350 hours or more. The disparity in training time amplified the Mustang's technical advantages. The strategic implications were profound and immediately recognized at the highest levels of German command. American heavy bombers had been attacking German industry for months, but the Luftwaffe had been able to inflict enough losses to make the Americans question the sustainability of the campaign. In October 1943, during the infamous Schweinfurt raid, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers out of 291 dispatched, a loss rate over 20%. Raids like that couldn't continue indefinitely without breaking the bomber force. But now, with long-range fighter escorts capable of protecting bombers throughout entire missions, loss rates would drop dramatically. The Luftwaffe would still achieve kills, but not enough to make the bombing campaign untenable. And while the Germans fought American fighters over Germany, those same bombers would be systematically destroying the factories that produced German aircraft, the refineries that produced aviation fuel, and the training facilities that produced pilots. The strategic death spiral was beginning, and the P-51 Mustang was the catalyst. Franz Stigler flew 20 more missions in March 1944. On 15 of those missions, he encountered Mustangs. They were everywhere, escorting bombers to targets he'd once considered beyond American fighter range. Berlin, Leipzig, Brunswick, Frankfurt, even Prague. Everywhere the bombers went, Mustangs followed. The Luftwaffe's traditional tactics of waiting until escorts turned back before attacking had become obsolete overnight. Now, German pilots had to fight through escorts to reach bombers, then fight through those same escorts to disengage, all while managing fuel consumption that limited their own mission duration. The Mustang pilots, by contrast, had fuel to spare. They could chase German fighters, engage in extended dogfights, and still have enough gas to escort bombers home and participate in combat if threatened during the return leg. It was an asymmetry that fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of every engagement. By April 1944, Luftwaffe fighter losses were climbing precipitously. Part of this was due to numerical attrition, simply too many missions against too many targets, but a significant portion came from Mustang engagements that German pilots couldn't avoid. The Americans were flying what they called fighter sweeps, sending Mustang formations ahead of bomber streams specifically to engage and destroy German interceptors before they could threaten the heavies. These sweeps were devastatingly effective. Luftwaffe fighters scrambling to intercept bombers would instead find themselves fighting for survival against Mustangs that had altitude, position, and numerical advantage. Gun camera footage from American aircraft showed Bf-109s and Fw-190s being destroyed in staggering numbers, many of them shot down before they could even reach the bomber formations they were scrambling to attack. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was severe. Knowing that enemy fighters could follow you anywhere, that there was no safe zone where you could operate without fighter interference, created constant stress. Pilots began looking over their shoulders constantly, knowing that a Mustang could be diving on them at any moment. Some experienced pilots adapted, developing tactics specifically for fighting Mustangs, but these techniques required skill and situational awareness that newer pilots simply didn't possess. The average life expectancy of a newly assigned Luftwaffe fighter pilot in mid-1944 was measured in missions, not months. They'd arrive at their units with minimal training, fly perhaps 10 or 15 missions, and then die in combat against opponents who had every advantage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Mustang's appearance coincided with another devastating development for the Luftwaffe. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week. This was a coordinated series of massive bombing raids, specifically targeting German aircraft production facilities. Thousands of American and British bombers struck factories producing Bf-109s, Fw-190s, and components for jet aircraft development. The raids were escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs, which not only protected bombers, but also conducted low-level strafing attacks on Luftwaffe airfields, destroying German aircraft on the ground. The combination of strategic bombing and long-range fighter escort proved catastrophic for German air power. Production facilities were damaged or destroyed, existing aircraft were shot down in unprecedented numbers, and the training pipeline that produced new pilots was overwhelmed by losses. The Luftwaffe had roughly 3,000 fighters available in early 1944. By summer, that number would decline to around 1,500, even though German factories were struggling to produce replacements at maximum capacity. The Americans, conversely, were ramping up production. By mid-1944, the 8th Air Force alone had over 1,000 fighters operational, most of them P-51 Mustangs. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy and attacking southern Germany, had hundreds more. The numerical disparity was becoming insurmountable. Franz Stigler's personal war ended in July 1944, when his fighter was badly damaged during a combat engagement with a formation of Mustangs near Munich. He managed to crash-land the aircraft and survived with injuries that ended his combat career. By that point, he'd accumulated over 400 combat missions and 28 confirmed victories, making him a recipient of the Knight's Cross, But even aces like Stigler couldn't overcome the mathematical inevitability that American industrial capacity, combined with the Mustang's capabilities, had created. The strategic air war over Germany was lost. The only question was how long it would take for that reality to fully manifest. The Mustang's dominance continued through the fall of 1944 and into 1945. By the war's final months, Luftwaffe fighter operations had been reduced to sporadic, desperate attacks by increasingly inexperienced pilots flying aircraft that were often damaged or poorly maintained due to parts shortages. The P-51, meanwhile, had evolved through multiple variants, each improving on the original. The P-51D introduced a bubble canopy that improved rear visibility even further and used the Packard Merlin V1650 engine, producing 1,695 horsepower with water injection. Top speed exceeded 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, making it faster than any piston-engine fighter the Germans fielded. The final production variant, the P-51H, never saw combat but would have been faster still, with a top speed approaching 487 miles per hour. The legacy of the Mustang's introduction extends far beyond its immediate tactical impact. The aircraft proved that strategic escort fighters were not only possible but essential for daylight bombing campaigns. Post-war Air Force doctrine across the world incorporated this lesson. Long-range fighter escorts became standard for any bombing campaign, and aircraft designed for that role prioritized range and high-altitude performance alongside maneuverability and firepower. The Cold War's fighter bombers and multi-role aircraft traced their conceptual lineage directly to the P-51's operational paradigm. Soviet aviation strategists studied American tactics extensively, and post-war Soviet fighters showed clear influence from lessons learned watching Mustang operations over Germany. The focus on range, on operational flexibility, on creating aircraft that could perform multiple roles effectively, all reflected understanding that modern air warfare required more than just dogfighting capability. The Mustang also influenced engineering philosophy beyond aviation. Its development demonstrated the value of international collaboration, combining British engine technology with American airframe design to create something neither country could have produced alone. That lesson informed numerous post-war military development programs and contributed to the NATO alliance's emphasis on interoperability and shared technology. For the Germans, the Mustang's appearance represented a bitter confirmation of strategic realities they'd been avoiding. Germany had entered the war with technological advantages in several areas, including aviation. The Bf 109 was arguably the world's best fighter in 1939, and German pilots were superbly trained. But by mid-war, Allied industrial capacity had closed and then surpassed German technological leads. The Mustang wasn't just equal to German fighters, it was better in several key respects, and it was being produced in quantities Germany couldn't match. More importantly, it was being flown by pilots whose training was comprehensive and whose tactical doctrine emphasized teamwork and mutual support. German tactics in the war's later years became increasingly individualistic as unit cohesion broke down and experienced leaders were killed. The Allies maintained organizational effectiveness that multiplied their material advantages. The human cost of the air war over Germany remains staggering even from the perspective of 8 decades later. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 33,000 fighter pilots killed during the war, many of them during the final 2 years when Mustangs dominated the skies. American losses were also severe, over 26,000 airmen killed in European operations. But the critical difference was sustainability. The United States could absorb those losses, train replacements, and maintain operational strength. Germany could not. By early 1945, Luftwaffe fighter units were operating at a fraction of their authorized strength, flying aircraft with inadequate fuel, and staffed by pilots who had minimal training. Individual instances of brilliance still occurred. Pilots like Franz Stigler's comrades continued achieving victories through skill and courage. But individual excellence couldn't overcome systemic collapse. The final months of the war saw Mustangs ranging freely over Germany, strafing targets of opportunity, escorting the bombing raids that reduced German cities to rubble, and occasionally encountering token resistance from Luftwaffe fighters that were often destroyed before they could effectively engage. The last recorded air combat victory by a Mustang in Europe occurred on May 8, 1945, hours before Germany's unconditional surrender. The pilot, Lieutenant Hilton Thompson of the 364th Fighter Squadron, encountered a lone Fieseler Fi-156 Storch reconnaissance plane attempting to flee to neutral Sweden. Thompson shot it down, the final punctuation mark on a campaign that had systematically dismantled the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. Today, restored P-51 Mustangs fly at air shows around the world, their distinctive Merlin engine sounds evoking both nostalgia and awe. They represent an era when piston-engine fighter design reached its apex, when engineering excellence combined with strategic vision to create an aircraft that changed the course of history. For those who flew them, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was the embodiment of technological superiority, the physical manifestation of industrial capacity that authoritarian regimes couldn't match. For those who faced them, the Mustang was the instrument of inevitable defeat, proof that numerical and technological advantages would ultimately determine outcomes, regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. Franz Stigler survived the war, immigrated to Canada, and eventually reconciled with a former enemy pilot in a story that became its own legend. But in March 1944, when he first encountered that graceful, deadly American fighter deep over Germany, where no escort should have been able to reach, he understood immediately that something fundamental had changed. The invisible boundary that had protected German fighters, the fuel limitation that forced American escorts to turn back, the safe zone where interceptions could proceed without overwhelming interference. All of it had vanished in the time it took one American fighter to demonstrate it could follow German pilots anywhere they went. The Luftwaffe would continue fighting for another 14 months. Pilots would continue scrambling to intercept raids, would continue engaging American bombers and their escorts, would continue dying in cockpits over German soil. But the strategic outcome was sealed the moment Mustangs demonstrated they could escort bombers 1,200 miles deep into Germany and still have fuel to fight their way home. Technology had shifted the balance irrevocably. The rest was just a matter of time, attrition, and the grinding mathematics of industrial warfare. One aircraft, arriving in squadron strength over Germany in early 1944, had rewritten the rules of strategic air warfare and sealed the fate of the Luftwaffe. That's not hyperbole or propaganda. That's documented historical reality, written in combat reports, confirmed by gun camera footage, and validated by the simple fact that after the Mustang's introduction, the Luftwaffe never again controlled the skies over Germany. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.